There are no missing persons, only offerings. The official incident report will say the subject was lost, that they succumbed to the elements after the 72-hour window closed. That's the story we give the families in the press, because the truth is a far heavier burden to carry. Out here, in these mountains, people don't get lost, they get chosen. Let me tell you what my job isn't. It's not kicking in doors with a shotgun, and it's not dramatic helicopter rescues with stirring music in the background. My job is paperwork, probability statistics, and the particular ache you get in your lower back from hiking 20 miles with a 60-pound pack. For 15 years, I've been a search and rescue ranger, and I can tell you the wilderness doesn't have a soul or a personality. It has topography, weather patterns, and a completely indifferent relationship with human error. We don't fight the mountain, we manage the odds. It all boils down to patterns. A lost child will almost always travel downhill. A hunter, conditioned to look for game trails, will often follow them into a different drainage basin without realizing it. A despondent subject, that's the official term, will seek seclusion, often a place with a view or near water. We have profiles, behavioral models, search urgency charts. It's a science, cold and methodical. You draw your grid, you calculate your probability of detection, and you deploy your assets. You find them or you don't. Everyone gets fixated on the 72-hour window. The media loves it. It sounds like a ticking clock in a thriller, a deadline before the wilderness swallows someone whole. The reality is less dramatic. It's just the point on a survivability curve where the line dips sharply. After that, the mission status changes. We shift from a rescue operation to a recovery. The urgency is still there, but it's a different kind of urgency. The need to give a family closure, to fill out the final incident report so Deputy Thorne down at the county seat can close his file. The mountain doesn't care about the clock. It just is. The old-timers who've lived in these hollers their whole lives see it differently. They'll stop me at the trailhead, their faces creased like old leather, and offer unsolicited advice. "Don't go up past Raven's Tor after sundown, Elias," they'll say. "The air gets thin up there." They mean it in a way that has nothing to do with altitude. They talk about places where compasses spin for reasons other than magnetic interference, where you can walk for hours and hear nothing, not a bird, not an insect, just a heavy, listening silence. They call it the stillness. Superstition, folklore, ghost stories to keep kids from wandering off. Every national park has them. I've heard them all, and I've found a logical explanation for every single one. That unnatural silence? A temperature inversion trapping sound waves. Spinning compasses? A localized iron deposit, plain and simple. Every mystery has a mundane solution if you just apply the correct procedure. You trust your training, your map, your GPS. You don't trust campfire stories. Still, there are things that stick with you, the loose threads in an otherwise tidy report. I remember a search a few years back for a young woman who'd gone off trail in the Hemlock Valley. We had her last known point pinned to a 10-meter square. We brought in the best canine unit from the state, a German shepherd named Zeus, who could find a dropped car key in a hurricane. But when the handler brought him to the edge of the valley, Zeus just sat down. He whined, tucked his tail, and refused to move another inch. The handler tried everything, but the dog that had found dozens of people was suddenly terrified of a patch of trees. We chalked it up to a passing animal, a bear or a cougar whose scent was too intimidating. We searched the valley on foot for a week and found nothing. Not a boot print, not a broken branch, not a single scrap of fabric. It was like she had simply evaporated. The case is still open, but we all know it's closed. It was a professional failure, an anomaly in the data, and nothing more. The call came in on a Tuesday morning, the sky a crisp, indifferent blue. The subject's name was Kenji Tanaka, 46 years old, a botanist from a university out east, in the park on a research permit to study alpine lichens. His rental car was found at the Hemlock Valley trailhead, exactly where his filed itinerary said it would be. He was overdue by 24 hours. On paper, it was the most routine kind of mission. Tanaka wasn't a tourist in flip-flops. His file showed advanced wilderness first aid certifications and a gear list that was practically a textbook example of preparedness. He was a low-risk subject in a moderate-risk environment, a statistical slam dunk. I established the incident command post at the ranger station, the familiar rhythm of procedure a comfort against the low hum of anxiety that always precedes a search. We had his point last seen, his intended route, and a solid profile. I laid the topo maps across the big table, drew the initial search grids, and started deploying assets. Ground teams on the primary trail, a secondary team sweeping the creek bed. By noon, the initial sweep was complete, yielding nothing. Standard. A subject like Tanaka, if injured, would likely be just off trail. We expanded the grid. That's when the small, easily dismissible problems began. My handheld GPS started blinking out, losing satellite lock for minutes at a time. I chalked it up to solar flares, or the canyon's steep walls creating a signal shadow. Then reports started trickling in over the radio from the other teams. Their units were doing the same thing. More troubling were the compass readings. 2 separate team leaders called to report their needles were off by as much as 20 degrees from their map bearings. I radioed back, telling them to check for interference, to move to a different spot and recalibrate. I rattled off the standard explanation: significant iron deposits in the granite formations of the valley. It was a plausible theory, one he'd used before. It just felt thin this time, a frayed blanket trying to cover too much. On day 2, we brought in the dogs. The handler was a seasoned pro named Dave, with a beautiful and frighteningly intelligent Malinois called Rogue. They started at the trailhead, and Rogue picked up the scent almost immediately, pulling Dave along the main path with confident tugs. For an hour, it was a textbook track. Then they reached the point where the trail forks, one path climbing the ridge, the other descending deeper into the silent, old-growth hemlocks of the valley floor. Tanaka's itinerary said he was going down. Rogue stopped dead. It was an exact echo of the incident with Zeus years ago, a memory I'd filed away under unexplained gear failure. The dog lowered its head, the fur on its neck bristling. A low whine escaped its throat, a sound of pure distress. Dave coaxed, commanded, offered treats. Rogue wouldn't budge. The dog looked into that valley like it was staring into an open furnace, planting its paws and resisting every pull on the leash. It wasn't stubbornness, it was primal fear. We had to abort the canine search. For the next 4 days, we grid searched that valley on foot until the topography was burned into my memory. We rappelled into crevices, waded through ice-cold streams, and pushed through rhododendron thickets so dense you couldn't see your own feet. We found nothing. Not a footprint in the soft earth by the creek. Not a thread from his pack snagged on a branch. Not a single wrapper from the high-energy bars listed on his gear manifest. An experienced man like Tanaka, a meticulous researcher, had walked into Hemlock Valley and the world had simply erased him. On the 5th day, I made the call. We suspended the active search, pending new information we all knew would never come. Deputy Marcus Thorne drove up from the county office to get my signature on the preliminary report. He scanned the pages, his pen tapping a neat rhythm on his clipboard. "Looks thorough, Elias," he said, his eyes never quite meeting mine. "Another tragic accident. These mountains don't forgive mistakes." I just nodded, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. There was no mistake here. There was only a perfect void, a complete and total absence of data. The professional failure was a heavy weight, but beneath it was something colder and sharper, a splinter of dread, a feeling that we hadn't failed to find a clue, but that there had never been a clue to find. The week after we called off the search for Kenji Tanaka was filled with a hollow quiet. The volunteer teams went home, the extra vehicles left the parking lot, and the station returned to its normal, sleepy rhythm. I spent my days catching up on the mountains of paperwork a multi-day SAR operation generates, each form a sterile monument to our failure. Every time I wrote, "No trace found," the words felt like a confession of incompetence. The professional certainty I had built my career on had fractured, and the silence of Hemlock Valley seemed to have followed me back, lingering in the corners of my office. It was during one of these long, quiet afternoons that Lena Petrova appeared at my door. Lena was a fixture, part of the park's topography, with 25 years of service etched into the lines around her eyes. She was due to retire in a few months and had mostly taken to desk duty, a quiet presence who spoke little and observed everything. She held 2 mugs of coffee, steam coiling from them like morning mist. "You look like you've been wrestling a ghost, Elias," she said, her voice low and gravelly. She placed a mug on my desk without waiting for an invitation. "Walk with me." It wasn't a request. I followed her past the main dispatch room, away from the public-facing areas, and down a corridor I rarely used. She stopped at an unmarked wooden door at the far end of the building, a place I'd always assumed was a storage closet for obsolete equipment. She produced a tarnished brass key from her pocket and unlocked it. The air that rolled out was cool and smelled of old paper and dust. The room was small, windowless, and dominated by a massive, scarred oak table. The walls were covered not with official, glossy Park Service maps, but with aging, yellowed USGS topographical charts, pinned up in a sprawling mosaic of our jurisdiction. But these were different. They were covered in a dense web of handwritten annotations, a secret language written in faded ink and sharp pencil. Lena gestured for me to come closer. "The search you just ran," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "the grids, the press releases, the reports for the county, that's the procedure. It's necessary. It shows we're doing the job we're paid to do." She paused, letting the implication hang in the dusty air. "It's not the real work." My eyes scanned the maps, trying to process the chaos of information. There were dates going back decades, penned next to small, cryptic symbols. Some areas were circled in red, with stark warnings. "Sound does not carry," "unstable ground," "not geological." I saw a familiar contour, Hemlock Valley. A thick black cross was marked over the very area we had just searched. Next to it, in Lena's neat, economical script, were several notations. "Compass unratified," read one. "Canine refusal zone," read another. Below that was a list of dates, a grim chronology of loss. I saw the year of the search for the young woman, the one where Zeus, the German shepherd, had balked. And at the very bottom, freshly added in pencil, was Kenji Tanaka's name. "The iron deposits," I said, the words feeling foolish and hollow as they left my mouth. "The solar flares. Those are the answers for the incident reports," Lena corrected gently, her gaze fixed on the map. She tapped a finger on another annotation near the valley, a quote scrawled in the margin, "The air gets thin." It was the exact phrase the old-timers used. My dismissal of their words felt like a brand of arrogance. This wasn't folklore. It was a field report. She unrolled another map on the table. It was a larger-scale version of the park, but this one charted things that didn't exist on any official survey. There were lines that had nothing to do with elevation or water, connecting disparate points across the park. A high mountain tor to a deep forested basin, a cave system to a specific stretch of river. It was a shadow map, a rendering of a different kind of reality layered over the one I knew. This was a geography of phenomena, not of terrain. "For some incidents," Lena said, her voice heavy with a weariness that went far beyond her years of service, "there is no rescue. There is no recovery. There is only management. The public-facing operation is for them. It gives them a narrative they can understand. But for us, the real work is knowing when not to search, where not to look. We don't find them because we're not supposed to. She looked at me then, her eyes searching my face, gauging the impact of this heresy. My entire professional world, built on logic, procedure, and the unwavering belief that everything could be found and explained, was crumbling. The map wasn't a collection of superstitions. It was data, decades of it, and it was telling me that the failure in Hemlock Valley wasn't an anomaly, it was the protocol. The next morning, Lena was waiting for me by one of the park's oldest trucks, the engine rumbling with a low, steady growl. She didn't say where we were going, only that I should leave my official SAR pack at the station. "You won't need a GPS where we're headed," she'd said. "You just need to learn how to see." We drove in silence for 20 minutes, turning off the main park road and onto a barely there service track overgrown with weeds. This wasn't a public access point. This was a place you only went if you had a specific and likely unpleasant reason. We hiked for an hour, my boots crunching on the familiar trail, my mind trying to impose the old order on this new context. I was classifying trees, noting animal tracks, estimating our elevation gain, the ingrained habits of a decade and a half. Lena walked with an unhurried, economical gait, her eyes constantly scanning not the path ahead, but the periphery. Finally, she stopped beside a massive Douglas fir. "What do you see here, Elias?" she asked. I looked the tree over. "Bark stripping," I said, my voice confident with procedure. "Probably a black bear, maybe a porcupine sharpening its teeth." We'd noted in the trail report, check for other signs of animal activity in the area. "Look closer," she urged. She ran a calloused finger over the exposed wood. The bark had been peeled back in long, elegant spirals, ascending the trunk in a perfect, repeating pattern. There were no claw marks, no tooth scrapes. The edges of the peeling were unnaturally clean, as if sliced with a razor-sharp tool. It wasn't the chaotic gouging of an animal. It was deliberate, almost artistic. A bear would have shredded it. A porcupine would have gnawed. This was something else entirely. "Animals are driven by need," Lena said softly. "They don't have time for geometry." We continued on, climbing higher, until the dense forest gave way to a rocky, wind-swept ridgeline. Here, she showed me the cairns. I'd seen thousands of cairns in my career, the friendly little stone stacks left by hikers to mark the trail. These were not those. They were precarious, impossible sculptures. Flat, heavy stones balanced on their narrowest edges, smaller pebbles supporting immense weight, all assembled in a way that seemed to mock the laws of physics. A stiff wind was blowing across the ridge, yet they stood perfectly still. "Wind erosion can do funny things," I offered, the explanation sounding weak even to me. "For how many centuries, Elias?" she countered, gesturing to the heavy patina of lichen covering the stones. "These aren't trail markers. You don't use these to find your way. You use them to know you're in a place where your way doesn't matter anymore. They're a signpost, a warning. The territory is speaking. You've just been trained to ignore it." The final lesson of the day came as the sun began to dip towards the horizon. She led me to the lip of a small, bowl-shaped basin, just a mile north of the Hemlock Valley trailhead. It was a place I'd passed through a dozen times. As we approached, a change came over the landscape. It was subtle at first. I noticed the birdsong had faded. Then the chirping of crickets and the buzz of insects fell away. We stood at the edge of the basin, and the world went utterly silent. It wasn't quiet. Quiet is the absence of loud noise. This was an absence of all noise. The wind that had been whipping at my jacket on the ridge died completely. The leaves on the aspens below us hung motionless, as if painted on a canvas. I held my breath, listening, and the only sound I could hear was the frantic pounding of my own heart and the rush of blood in my ears. It was a vacuum, a profound and unnerving nullity that felt like it was actively pressing in on me. "Temperature inversion," I whispered, the old excuse a desperate prayer to the god of rational explanations. Lena shook her head slowly, her eyes closed as if she were listening to something I couldn't perceive. "No," she said, "this is what the old-timers call the stillness. It's a symptom, not a cause. It's what happens when the territory draws its breath, when it's hungry." Standing there, engulfed by that crushing silence, I finally understood. The spinning compasses, the terrified dogs, the impossibly peeled bark. They weren't separate, random anomalies. They were a dialect. They were the vocabulary of a presence whose existence I had systematically denied. We weren't looking for a man who had gotten lost. We were standing in the empty space he had once occupied, a space cleared to make way for a negotiation I never knew was taking place. Back in the windowless room, the air was stale with the ghosts of forgotten conversations. The silence we had experienced in the basin felt different here. It wasn't an active presence, but a dead, muffled quiet, the kind found in tombs. Lena left the shadow maps on the wall and moved to a heavy steel filing cabinet in the corner, the kind the military uses for classified documents. It was secured with a combination lock that spun with a series of heavy, satisfying clicks. "Maps show you the where," she said, swinging the thick door open, "but they don't explain the why, or the how often." Inside there were no files or folders. There were books, a dozen of them, thick and uniform, bound in dark green leather, their spines unmarked save for a small, embossed Park Service emblem. They looked more like financial ledgers than field journals. She lifted one of the oldest volumes from the shelf with a care that bordered on reverence and placed it on the oak table. The cover was worn smooth at the edges, and a faint smell of dry leather and old paper filled the space between us. She opened it to a page near the middle. The paper was thick, cream-colored, and filled with elegant cursive script penned in black ink. The page was divided into neat columns. On the left, a date, July 14th, 1928. A name, William Donahue. A short procedural description of the incident. Prospector, reported overdue by partner. Vehicle located at Granite Creek. Extensive grid search conducted for 7 days. No trace found. Subject declared lost, presumed deceased. It was the archaic ancestor of the reports I still filed today. "I recognize that name," I said. "Donahue's Folly. It's a canyon up in the North District. The story is he went mad looking for gold and just wandered off." "That's the official story," Lena replied, her finger tracing the faded ink. "It's a good one, plausible. It gives people an ending they can live with." She then slid her finger across the page to the right-hand column, a section of the ledger I hadn't paid attention to. It was labeled Jurisdictional Status. The entry for that year was concise. No significant wildfire activity recorded. Mild winter, low ungulate mortality, unseasonably low instances of rockfall on major park roads. I looked at her, my mind failing to make the connection. It seemed like a random collection of ecological notes, the kind of data we compile for our annual reports. Lena didn't say a word. She simply turned the page. Another name, another zero-trace disappearance from 1934, and beside it in the Jurisdictional Status column, Eastern Pine Beetle. Infestation receded unexpectedly. Record seasonal rainfall broke a 2-year drought. She turned the page again. And again. A lost botanist in 1947, followed by a note about a flash flood that dissipated before hitting the main valley. A pair of hikers who vanished from their tent in 1959, followed by a winter so mild the park's budget had a surplus for the first time in a decade. My training, my analytical mind, started to connect the data points, fighting against the horrifying conclusion that was taking shape. I reached for a newer ledger, one from my own time. I flipped through the pages, my hands shaking slightly, until I found the entry for the young woman from Hemlock Valley, the search where the dog had refused to track. The left side was the familiar, sterile summary of our failure. On the right, the status entry read, "Potential landslide at Ravens Tor stabilized without intervention. No new cases of wasting disease reported in the deer population. It was an immaculate and terrifying record, a balance sheet. On one side, a human life. On the other, a reprieve from disaster. A life for a fire, a life for a flood, a life for a plague. For nearly a century, a secret account was being kept within the park's borders, and the currency was human. "They're not accidents," I said, their words feeling like stones in my throat. None of them were. "An accident is a random event," Lena said, her voice impossibly weary. "This is not random, it's a cycle. The territory needs to maintain its equilibrium. When the pressure builds, a drought, a disease, the risk of a catastrophic fire, a debt comes due. The stillness it collects." I sank into a chair, the weight of 100 years of calculated sacrifice settling on my shoulders. This was the real work of a senior ranger. It wasn't managing wildlife or maintaining trails. It was managing this ledger. It was understanding that the beautiful, peaceful park I had dedicated my life to protecting was paid for by a periodic, unspoken tithe. The old-timers' superstitions, the zones of silence, the impossible signs, it was all part of a system, a negotiation with a force that had no name. I thought of Kenji Tanaka. He wasn't a failure I needed to solve. He was a transaction that had just been completed. His meticulously planned expedition, his expertise, his strength, none of it mattered. He had been in the wrong place at the right time, a perfect offering to appease the deep, quiet hunger of the land and buy another season of calm. My world operated on two parallel tracks after that. On one, I was SAR Ranger Elias Vance, filing reports, checking trail conditions, and giving safety briefings to tourists. On the other, I was Lena's apprentice, spending my evenings in the dusty archive room, learning the true and terrible nature of my jurisdiction. But the ledger wasn't just a history, it was a predictive tool. Lena showed me how to read the subtle shifts in the data, an uptick in minor rockfalls, a change in the water table, an increase in aggressive animal encounters. These were precursors, she explained, tremors before the earthquake. The tithe paid by Kenji Tanaka had bought calm, but it was a temporary peace. The system was already showing signs of instability. The signs became impossible to ignore. A herd of elk, normally timid and elusive, stampeded through a public campground one night, their eyes wide with a terror that had nothing to do with people. Then came the weather. While the surrounding counties baked in a late summer heat wave, a dense, impossibly cold fog began to form over the park's central peaks. It didn't move or dissipate, it just sat there, a localized, unnatural weather system that defied every meteorological model. The air beneath it grew thick with the smell of ozone and wet stone. Lena grew quiet, her face a mask of grim concentration. The offering wasn't enough, she told me one evening, her voice strained. Sometimes it's not a clean transaction. The balance is precarious. We need to remind the territory that the debt was paid. She retrieved a small, locked metal box from the bottom of the filing cabinet. Inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed cotton, were a handful of small, mundane objects. A tarnished silver locket, a simple brass compass, its needle frozen in place, a whittled wooden bird, smoothed by the touch of 1,000 restless fingers. They were personal effects, the single items recovered from the vehicles or campsites of the zero trace victims over the years, the only physical proof they had ever existed. Official procedure was to hold them in evidence indefinitely. The real protocol was this. A formal acknowledgement, she explained, her voice low. We can't bring them back, but we can show that they are not forgotten. It's a gesture of respect. It placates the stillness. We drove out at dusk, the strange, localized storm brewing directly over our destination, a geological feature marked on the shadow map only as the altar. It was a massive, sheer granite monolith that rose from the forest floor, its face scoured smooth by ancient glaciers. At its base was a deep, dark fissure, a crack that plunged into the bedrock of the mountain itself. The air here was vibrating, a low hum that I felt in my teeth and bones. The unnatural silence from the basin was gone. This was its opposite, a place of immense, contained energy. Lena handed me the brass compass. It had belonged to a hiker who had vanished in the 70s. "Each of us must do it," she said. "The duty has to be passed on, witnessed." My hands trembled as I took the cold metal. This was a perversion of everything I had ever stood for. My job was to save people, to bring them home. Now I was participating in a ritual that consecrated their loss, treating a human life as a bargaining chip in a negotiation with something incomprehensible. I walked to the edge of the fissure. The air rising from it was ancient and cold, carrying a scent of deep earth and something else, something metallic and sharp, like shed blood after a rain. Lena went next, holding the small, silver locket. She stood before the crack for a long moment, her lips moving in a silent prayer or a quiet apology. I couldn't tell which. She placed the locket on a small ledge just inside the fissure, a gesture of profound and sorrowful respect. As I stepped forward, compass in hand, the low hum intensified. The wind swirled around the monolith, carrying whispers that sounded like words I almost understood. I thought of Kenji Tanaka, of the young woman, of the prospector from 1928, and all the names in the ledger. They weren't just case files anymore. They were the foundation of the fragile peace I had taken for granted my entire career. This wasn't a rescue, it was containment, not of a person, but of a catastrophe. I placed the compass beside the locket, the cold brass a stark contrast to the living rock. As my fingers left the metal, a deep, resonant thrum echoed up from the fissure, as if a colossal bell had been struck deep within the earth. The unnatural wind died instantly. The vibrating hum in the air faded into nothing. Above us, the roiling, localized storm clouds seemed to thin, breaking apart to reveal the first pale stars of the evening. The pressure was gone. The balance, for now, was restored. In the days following the ritual at the altar, a profound and unsettling peace settled over the park. The unnatural fog over the peaks vanished overnight. The wildlife returned to its familiar, predictable patterns. A gentle, steady rain fell for 2 days, soaking the dry forests and lowering the fire danger from extreme to moderate. To my colleagues, to the tourists, to the county officials, it was just a lucky break in the weather. To me, it was the chilling confirmation of a successful transaction. The silence in the woods no longer felt peaceful, it felt paid for. The final piece of official business for the Kenji Tanaka case landed on my desk a week later. It was a thick file containing the full search and rescue operational summary, volunteer logs, equipment manifests, and my concluding statement. Deputy Thorne had already signed off on his part, and all it needed was my final signature before being sent to the Tanaka family. My job now was to translate the incomprehensible horror of the ledger into the sterile, comforting language of bureaucratic procedure. I spent a full day crafting the narrative. It was my finest work of fiction. I wrote about the difficult terrain in Hemlock Valley, the unpredictable weather systems common at high altitudes, and the inherent risks of solo hiking. I constructed a plausible scenario where Mr. Tanaka, an expert in his field, could have taken a fatal fall into one of the many deep, water-filled crevasses that honeycomb the valley floor, a place where a body could remain undiscovered for decades, if not forever. Every word was precise, professional, and a complete and utter lie. The report offered a logical conclusion, a tragic but understandable accident. It gave the family an ending, as Lena would say. It was a kindness made of poison. 2 weeks later, I sat in a sterile meeting room at a hotel downtown, facing Kenji Tanaka's wife and son. They had flown in to collect his personal effects from the rental car and receive my final briefing. Mrs. Tanaka was a small, dignified woman with eyes that held a universe of grief. His son was a college student, trying his best to be the strong one, his jaw set in a tight, trembling line. I walked them through the search, my voice steady, my tone compassionate. I spread the official maps on the table, pointing to the search grids, showing them the sheer scale of the effort we had undertaken. I explained the challenges, the equipment failures, attributing them to the iron deposits, of course, and the agonizing decision to suspend the search. He was so meticulous, Mrs. Tanaka said, her voice a fragile whisper. He never took chances. No, ma'am, he did not, I replied, my own voice a hollow echo. Your husband was the model of a prepared outdoorsman. This was a tragedy of circumstance, not of carelessness. The mountains can be unforgiving. The son looked at me, his eyes sharp and questioning. You're sure? There was nothing? No sign at all? I held his gaze, the weight of the badge on my chest feeling heavier than my SAR pack. Nothing, I said, the single word a betrayal of everything I was supposed to represent. I am truly sorry. They thanked me for my efforts, for my honesty. The handshake from Tanaka's son was firm, a gesture of gratitude for the comforting lies I had just fed his family. As I walked out of that hotel, the sun felt too bright, the sounds of the city too loud. I was an imposter in my own uniform. The love I once had for the wilderness, for its raw beauty, its logical systems, its indifference, was gone, replaced by a cold and watchful dread. I no longer saw a landscape of trees and rock, but a place of immense, ancient appetite. The mountains I had sworn to protect were now a source of deep, abiding fear. The knowledge Lena had given me was a solitary confinement. I couldn't share it with my fellow rangers, with my friends, or with the families who looked to me for answers. I was the keeper of a truth that would sound like madness to anyone else. Every time I hiked a trail now, I felt the weight of that unseen presence, the constant, low-level hum of the negotiation. My job was no longer about finding the lost. It was about ensuring the ledger remained balanced, about being the silent accountant for a debt paid in human lives. The wilderness was no longer a place of refuge. It was my warden. Lena's retirement party was a depressingly cheerful affair. There was a sheet cake with the Park Service logo poorly rendered in green frosting, lukewarm coffee in paper cups, and a series of heartfelt but hollow speeches about her decades of dedicated service. Our colleagues praised her professionalism, her calm demeanor in a crisis, her encyclopedic knowledge of the park's flora and fauna. They had no idea. They saw the public-facing ranger, the woman who managed budgets and personnel, not the quiet priestess who managed a bloody truce with a primordial entity. I watched her smile and accept the accolades, a polite and distant figure, and I saw for the first time how utterly exhausted she was. The weight of the ledgers was a physical thing, a stoop in her shoulders that no amount of rest could cure. After everyone had gone home, she found me in the archive room. The place already felt like mine, a silent, windowless tomb I was destined to inherit. She didn't say anything for a long time, just ran her hand over the spine of the oldest ledger. My predecessor was a man named Miller, she said, her voice soft in the enclosed space. He was the one who started the ledgers, back when this was all just national forest land. He thought he was a scientist, documenting a strange ecological cycle. He didn't understand the reciprocity of it all until it was too late. It broke him. He spent the last 10 years of his life as a greeter at the main gate, telling campfire stories that everyone thought were just tall tales. She turned to face me, and in her hands were two objects. The first was the tarnished brass key to the archive room door. The second was a small, leather-bound notebook containing a handwritten list of numbers. The combination for the cabinet, she said, pressing them into my palm. The key is for the door. Don't ever lose them. And don't ever write the combination down anywhere else. Her touch was light, but the transfer of responsibility was immense, a physical weight passing from her to me. I was no longer her apprentice, I was her successor. Your job isn't to fight it, Elias, she said, her eyes boring into mine, impressing the importance of her final lesson. You can't. It's like trying to fight the tide or the turning of the seasons. There is no winning. There is only managing the terms of the arrangement. That's all this has ever been. She walked to the shadow map, her finger tracing one of the strange, non-topographical lines that connected the door. Disparate parts of the park. These are the boundaries. Not the ones on the official maps that separate federal land from private property, but the real ones. The places where its influence is strongest. Your first duty is to keep people away from them. Use trail closures, cite wildlife preservation, blame soil erosion. I don't care what official reason you give. You are the keeper of the boundary now. Her final instructions were a litany of strange, vital tasks. I was to monitor the ecological precursors, watch the animal behavior, and listen to the whispers of the old-timers, for they often felt the shifts before we did. I was to maintain the ledgers with cold, dispassionate accuracy. I was to protect the secret at all costs, because the truth would cause a panic that would be far more dangerous than the threat itself. This knowledge will cost you, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. It will isolate you. It will make you lie to people you respect. It will make you see the world as a fragile, temporary thing. I'm sorry for that, but someone has to do it. The park, and everyone in it, is safer because they don't know what you know. She gave me a final, sad smile, a look of profound pity and shared burden. Then she turned and walked out of the room, closing the heavy door behind her. I heard the sound of her footsteps fading down the hall, and then there was only the dead, muffled silence. I stood there for a long time, the key and the notebook feeling impossibly heavy in my hand. I was no longer Elias Vance, SAR Ranger. That man, the one who believed in procedure and probability, had vanished in Hemlock Valley along with Kenji Tanaka. In his place stood someone else, a warden of a secret prison, a tender of a terrible garden, a lonely sentry on a border that couldn't be seen but was profoundly, terrifyingly real. The 6 months after Lena left were the longest of my life. The park's outward rhythm continued unchanged. The summer crowds gave way to the autumn leaf peepers, who in turn gave way to the hard silence of winter. I performed my duties with a mechanical precision that my superiors praised as exemplary. I led patrols, maintained equipment, and filed meticulously detailed reports. But my real work began after hours, alone in the windowless archive room, under the flat, sterile light of a single fluorescent bulb. I became a student of the ledger and the shadow map. I cross-referenced decades of zero-trace incidents with geological surveys, weather archives, and wildlife population data. Lena's annotations were my guide, but I started adding my own, tracking the subtle precursors she had taught me to see. A fractional drop in the water level of the high-altitude lakes, an increase in coyote sightings in the lower valleys, a series of minor, unexplained tremors on the park's seismic sensors that never registered outside our borders. The territory was breathing, and I was learning to count its respirations. The piece Kenji Tanaka's offering had purchased was holding, but the data showed the pressure was slowly, inevitably building again. The call came on a cold, bright Thursday in early March. The static crackle of the radio was a familiar sound, but the words it carried landed like body blows. Dispatch to Ranger Vance. I keyed the mic on my shoulder. Vance, go ahead. Elias, we've got a 211 in progress. Vehicle located at the Hemlock Valley trailhead. Subject is a Sarah Mills, 24, female. Overdue by 12 hours. Her roommate said she was just going for a day hike. Hemlock Valley. The name hung in the air of my truck's cab, a cold and heavy thing. For a moment, I didn't respond. I saw the black cross on Lena's map, the list of names written beside it, the fresh pencil marking of Kenji Tanaka. The cycle had come around again. "Vance to dispatch," I said, my voice a perfect imitation of the calm, procedural ranger I used to be. "Copy that. I'm en route to the trailhead to confirm the vehicle and establish the point last seen. Notify Deputy Thorne. We'll need to set up a unified incident command post at the station. I want preliminary search teams on standby." "Copy, Elias. Dispatch out." Every action was a lie. I wasn't going to establish a point last seen. There wouldn't be one. I wasn't preparing for a search. I was preparing for a performance. The entire elaborate theater of a search and rescue operation was about to begin, and I was its reluctant director. Back at the station, I bypassed my own office and walked straight to the archive. The brass key felt cool and solid in my hand. The combination lock on the cabinet spun open with a series of clicks that sounded like a clock ticking down. I pulled out the most recent ledger and the shadow map of the valley, spreading it across the oak table. There it was, the familiar contours, the red circled zones, the annotated warnings. This wasn't a map for finding someone. It was a map for defining the edges of their absence. Deputy Thorne arrived an hour later, his uniform crisp, his face a mask of professional concern. "Another one in Hemlock, huh?" he said, shaking his head as he studied the official topo map I had pinned to the main briefing room wall. "That valley's got bad luck." "It's treacherous terrain," I said, the lie tasting familiar now. "We'll start with a standard perimeter sweep and grid search." "Dogs?" he asked. "The handlers are on their way," I answered, knowing full well what would happen. "But with the wind patterns in that canyon, a scent trail will be difficult to establish." I was already building the narrative for the final report, planting the seeds of plausible failure. For the next 4 days, I went through the motions. I directed ground teams, coordinated with the air unit, and gave solemn, measured updates to the press. I watched as the canine unit, a different dog but the same breed as the last one, stopped dead at the fork in the trail and refused to enter the valley proper. I listened to the field reports of compass deviations and GPS glitches, and I dutifully logged them as equipment malfunction due to localized magnetic interference. I performed my role flawlessly. Late on the 5th night, after I had officially suspended the active search, I returned to the silent archive. The adrenaline and caffeine that had sustained me for days had worn off, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. I sat at the oak table and opened the green leather ledger to the first clean page. My hand was steady as I picked up the pen. I wrote the date. I wrote her name, Sarah Mills. I filled in the official details, age, physical description, the sterile summary of the failed search. Then my pen hovered over the right-hand column, jurisdictional status. It was still blank. The payment had been made, but the invoice had yet to be stamped. I didn't know if the park would be granted a mild fire season, a reprieve from a coming beetle infestation, or a stabilization of some crumbling rock face. I only knew that the balance had been met. This was my job now, not to find them, but to record them, to be the lonely witness to the transaction, the keeper of the terrible account. I closed the book, the soft thud of the leather cover echoing in the quiet room. I put the ledger back in its place, locked the cabinet, and walked out into the cold night air. Tomorrow I would begin the paperwork for Sarah Mills's family, crafting another careful story of a tragic accident. The cycle would continue. My duty was to stand on the boundary, not of the park, but of the truth, and ensure no one else ever crossed it. Elias's story reminds us that some truths are a far heavier burden than any 60-pound pack. We began by questioning who gets lost and who gets chosen, only to discover the real choice was the one forced upon the keeper of the secret. In the end, the line between protector and accomplice is as thin and permanent as a new name written in an old ledger. Thank you for walking these shadowed trails with us here at Silent Whispers. The weight of Elias's duty leaves us with a difficult question about the nature of his actions. Was the carefully constructed lie he told the families a necessary act of compassion, or was it an unforgivable betrayal? Until we meet again, listen closely to the quiet places. We'll be back soon when a dusty, forgotten field journal reveals the story of a previous keeper, and we learn what happens when the truce with the wilderness is finally broken.